Hello class, welcome to lesson 1-3, which is all about properties of numbers. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to recognize the properties of equality and identity, and you should be able to recognize the commutative and associative properties. Let's look at some vocab for this section. Let's start with equivalent expression. An equivalent expression is an expression that represents the same number, okay? An additive identity is the sum of any number and 0 is equal to the number. So for example, 1 plus 0 is still 1. 3 plus 0 is still 3. So you end up with whatever the number is. That is called the additive identity. Okay? The multiplicative identity is the product of any number and 1 is equal to the number. Okay, so 36 times 1 is still 36. 374,000 times 1 is still 374,000. Okay, multiplying by 1 doesn't change your answer. Okay, what about the multiplicative inverse? Multiplicative inverse is two numbers whose product is 1. Okay, and I'm going to give an example of that in just a minute after we talk about a reciprocal. A reciprocal is the same thing. It's two numbers whose product is 1. Okay, so you might be a little bit confused by this, but if we have the, it's easiest to see first with fractions. So if we talk about 3/4, if we multiply by the multiplicative inverse, that would have to be 4/3, because if we do that, on top we're going to end up with 12 over 12, and that's the same as 1. So it's a multiplicative inverse is when you multiply by the reciprocal of a number and you end up with an answer of 1. Okay? So that ties in nicely to the multiplicative identity. The commutative property, okay, so this is talking about how the order in which numbers are added or multiplied does not change their sum or product. Okay, so 3 plus 4 equals 4 plus 3. Order doesn't matter. Same with multiplication. 3 times 4 equals 4 times 3. That is called the commutative property. And let's look at our last vocab word, which is associative property. The associative property is grouping. Grouping numbers. Grouping numbers when adding or multiplying does not change the sum or product. Okay, so you might be a little confused by that one, so let's take a look. If I have 3 times 4 times 5, and I group my 3 and 4 together, so then I have a 12 times 5, that's 60. Now let's look, if we were to have grouped that a different way, what if we had grouped and done 4 times 5 first, then we'd have 20. 3 times 20, which is also 60. So you can see that the order that you group in doesn't change. And the same goes for addition. I only did a multiplication example, but the same thing holds true for addition. Okay, so this is something that you may want to screenshot just to help you remember. Commutative property, just basically remember order doesn't matter. That's how you are going to help identify what you are doing. And then for the associative property, one good hint for that is notice that there is parentheses. That is because we are talking about grouping things. Okay? So parentheses is a good indicator that you're using the associative property. Now let's look at example 1. So I have, I start with 4 times 3 times 2 times 5. And I want to look at what property I use in each step. So on the left side, we have 4 times 3 times 2 times 5. On the right side, we have 4 times 5 times 3 times 2. So you can see I changed up the order. So let's look. What property is the one that means order doesn't matter? Our commutative property. Okay, so that's what we did in the first step there. And then going from the 4 times 5 times 3 times 2, now I have parentheses in there. I have inside the first set of parentheses 4 times 5 times our second set of parentheses, which contains 3 times 2. Which property deals with parentheses and grouping things together? That is our associative property. Okay? Now you may ask, now I go from the 4 times 5 times 3 times 2, and I have a 20 times 6. What is that called? We didn't talk about anything like that. Once you start performing operations and you don't end up with like a 1 or the same exact number, then you're going to call that substitution. Because instead of writing 4 times 5, we are substituting 20. Instead of writing 3 times 2, we are substituting 6. So this is called substitution. And then instead of writing 20 times 6, we are substituting 120. Alright, now what I want you guys to do is think about what we just talked about and use different groupings and stuff to solve this problem and see how it goes. Hopefully you ended up with 5 as your answer. If not, be sure to ask either myself or a friend for some help, and we'd be happy to help. Now let's look at example number 2. We want to solve and name each property, okay? So this first one on the left, we have 2.75 plus 3.5 plus 4.25 plus 1.5. I'm trying to think, what do I want my first step to be? What would be the easiest way to solve this problem? And I'm thinking, I see a 0.5 and a 0.5. I know that's going to make a whole number, so I think I want to put those by each other. And that works out nicely, because 0.75 plus 0.25 is also going to give me a whole number. So I think I'm going to change the order that these are in. I'm going to say 2.75 plus 4.25 plus 3.5 plus 1.5. And I know that that is the commutative property. I'm just going to abbreviate it as a C for now. Okay, now if I look at it, if I group these together, because if I don't group them, then I just have to go from left to right and add them together. So I'm going to group them, and I'm going to call that the associative property. I'm going to use a capital A so we don't think it's a variable. Next, I know that 2.75 plus 4.25, I have my 2 and my 4, that gives me 6, plus 1 more, that's going to be a 7, plus, and then I have 3 plus 1 is 4, plus 1 more is 5. And instead of writing those, I am just substituting whole numbers for them. And instead of writing 7 plus 5, let's substitute in a 12. So that is the final answer. When it tells you to name each property, like each step, this is what I want to see on your paper, okay? Alright, let's look at our next one. We have 3 times 7 times 10 times 2. Now, if you want to leave it in this order, you really can, and you can just group things, but I'm going to change it up just a little bit, just to practice my commutative property, and I'm going to say 7 times 10 times 3 times 2. I feel like that's going to work well for me personally. Okay, so I changed the order. That's the commutative property. Now, if I group these differently, 7 times 10 times 3 times 2. Remember, that's the associative property. Next, 7 times 10, I'm going to substitute a 70 in. And then I have 3 times 2, I'm going to substitute a 6 in. Now I have 70 times 6, and some of you might be saying, oh man, that's still a big number. Okay, what's 7 times 6? We have 42, we add on our 0, we're done. So our answer is 420, and we're substituting 420 in instead of writing 70 times 6, so we say substitution. Now I want you guys to take a look at this first example and see how you do. Okay, hopefully you ended up with 5.5 miles. If not, be sure to ask either myself or a friend. And I want you to try one more example and see how you do. Okay, hopefully you ended up with 180 as your final answer on this one. If not, be sure to ask either myself or a friend. And if you have any questions about anything I discussed in this lesson, be sure to ask me in class or email me. I'd be more than happy to help. I hope you guys have a great night.